Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. December 8, 1941. Tokyo. Imagine standing in the hushed command chamber of the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters. The air is thick with the tension of triumph, the faint echo of celebration seeping through the walls. Officers beam with pride, their voices rising in congratulatory fervor. The morning's daring strike against Pearl Harbor had, in their minds, secured Japan's place among the great powers of the world. But at the center of the room sits Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, silent and motionless, his expression as still as the ink on his orders. What thoughts churn behind that calm facade? He alone among them feels no joy. He does not celebrate. Through the window, he can see young officers laughing, already toasting victory. Yet within him grows only a cold dread. Why? Because Yamamoto knew America, not from maps or reports, but from experience. He had walked the roaring assembly lines of Detroit, where machines thundered like the heartbeat of a giant. He had seen the endless oil fields of Texas, where energy flowed like lifeblood across a continent. He understood what his homeland had just provoked, a slumbering titan whose industrial power could not be measured in mere ships or planes, but in unyielding capacity. Months earlier, he had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe with chilling precision. For the first 6 months, I can promise a fierce fight. Beyond that, I have no confidence. Now those words return to him like a haunting echo, carrying the weight of prophecy. Yes, the attack on Pearl Harbor had been an operational masterpiece. 8 battleships sunk or crippled, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. A blow so sudden and stunning that the world gasped. Yet, amid this triumph, lurked fatal omissions. The American aircraft carriers had escaped unscathed, and worse, Japan had achieved the one outcome Yamamoto most feared. It had united a divided America into a single, burning purpose. The mathematics of defeat were already written, though few could read them. Yamamoto could. His fellow commanders, lost in the intoxication of success, could not. None of them yet grasped that this moment, this very hour of celebration, had set in motion the greatest industrial awakening in human history. The United States would soon mobilize its factories, its labor, its ingenuity, with a ferocity the world had never witnessed. And so began the unraveling of Japan's grand illusion. Intelligence reports, strategic analyses, even their own instinct had warned them, yet they failed to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what they faced until it was far too late. America's industrial might would not merely crush Japan's fleets, it would shatter every assumption upon which Japan's war strategy had been built, about warfare, about power, about destiny itself. This descent into catastrophe had been paved long before that December morning with ambition, pride, and a tragic miscalculation. Throughout the 1930s, Japan had expanded relentlessly. Manchuria in 1931, China in 1937, French Indochina in 1940. Each conquest was another brick in their dream of a self-sufficient empire, rich in resources and shielded from Western influence. But deep within Japan's war plans lay an unspoken anxiety. They knew their limits. Their strategists had run the numbers. They saw the scale of the imbalance. By 1937, Japan's industrial output made up barely 5.2% of global manufacturing, comparable to France, and only half of Britain's or the Soviet Union's. The United States, even amid the Great Depression, controlled an astonishing 42% of the world's industrial power. America's war-making potential was 7 to 10 times greater than Japan's, an overwhelming cold arithmetic of destiny. They knew these facts. They discussed them, yet they gambled anyway. Their strategy rested on a single, perilous assumption: that swift, decisive victories, extending the momentum of Pearl Harbor, could secure a peace before the sleepless giant truly awoke. But as history would soon show, the giant was already stirring. December 8, 1941, Tokyo. Picture yourself inside the command chamber of the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters. The room hums with a restrained euphoria, the scent of ink and cigarette smoke mingling with the invisible pulse of victory. Outside, the muffled sound of laughter seeps through the corridors, the voices of men convinced they have altered the course of history. To them, the morning's audacious assault on Pearl Harbor has elevated Japan to the pinnacle of power. Yet, at the center of it all sits Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, utterly still. His eyes, calm and unreadable, give away nothing of the tempest roiling within. What does he see that others cannot? Around him, officers exchange jubilant salutes and proud smiles, basking in what they believe to be destiny fulfilled. But Yamamoto's thoughts drift elsewhere, toward a vision of dread. Why dread in a moment of triumph? Because Yamamoto knew America, not as an abstraction or a distant enemy, but as something he had felt and witnessed with his own eyes. He had walked the ceaseless assembly lines of Detroit, where steel beasts were born in a symphony of clattering machines. He had gazed across the boundless oil fields of Texas, shimmering under the sun like oceans of power. He understood the truth none of his colleagues could yet see. Japan had just roused a giant whose strength lay not in its battleships or its soldiers, but in its limitless capacity to build, to replenish, to endure. Months before, he had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in words that now echoed like a curse. For the first 6 months, I can promise a fierce fight. Beyond that, I have no confidence. Now, that grim prophecy seemed to hang in the air like smoke after an explosion. Yes, Pearl Harbor had been a masterpiece of planning and precision. 8 battleships destroyed or crippled, nearly 200 aircraft obliterated. A strike so sudden, so devastating, that the world reeled in shock. And yet, hidden beneath the glitter of success, lay fatal oversights. The American aircraft carriers had escaped, and more disastrously still, Japan had accomplished what no one in Washington had managed before. It had united America. A nation divided by politics and hesitation now stood bound by outrage and resolve. The mathematics of defeat had already been set in motion, though few could see it. Yamamoto could. His mind, sharper than any blade, read the numbers like an oracle. His peers, drunk on victory, mistook the first act of tragedy for the final curtain of triumph. None of them realized that this very hour, this moment of applause and self-congratulation, marked the beginning of the greatest industrial awakening in human history. Soon, the United States would harness its factories, its workforce, and its imagination with a force that would thunder across the oceans. Thus began the slow collapse of Japan's grand illusion. Reports, analyses, even instinct had warned them, and yet they had chosen to believe in a fantasy. The sheer scale of America's power defied comprehension until it was far too late. The coming struggle would not simply destroy Japan's military might, it would obliterate every belief its leaders held about war, empire, and fate itself. But this path to ruin had not begun that morning. It had been laid, stone by stone, through the 1930s, paved with ambition and pride, disguised as destiny. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 the full-scale war with China in 1937, the occupation of French Indochina in 1940, all were steps in Japan's relentless march to forge a self-reliant empire, free from Western constraint. Yet even as they expanded outward, a quiet fear lingered within their plans, an awareness of the impossible odds they faced. The numbers told their own ruthless story. By 1937, Japan's industrial power accounted for only 5.2% of the world's total, placing it on par with France and at merely half the strength of Britain or the Soviet Union. The United States, even weakened by the Great Depression, commanded nearly 42% of global manufacturing output. America's capacity for war production was not merely greater, it was 7 to 10 times Japan's. The Japanese planners knew these figures. They debated them, analyzed them, feared them, and still they chose to gamble. Their entire war plan rested upon a single, perilous hope, that lightning-fast victories, strung together after Pearl Harbor, could compel America to negotiate before the full weight of its industry came crashing down. But history is merciless to gamblers, and even as Tokyo celebrated, somewhere across the Pacific, the giant had already begun to stir. June 4th, 1942, the Midway Atoll. The trap was set. The stage and empty stretch of ocean would soon become the crucible that changed the course of the Pacific War. Dawn broke over calm waters as 4 of Japan's proudest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched wave after wave of aircraft toward Midway Island. To the Japanese commanders, it was the next bold stroke in a campaign of unstoppable conquest. But even as their bombers soared toward the island, the hunters were already being hunted. Across the ocean, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had taken position. Their aircraft were in the air, searching. What followed unfolded with breathtaking speed and chaos. American torpedo bombers, flying slow, obsolete TBD Devastators, attacked first. It was a massacre. Every single one of the 41 planes was shot down in flames, 41 men into the sea, their sacrifice seemingly in vain. Yet in that moment of disaster, they achieved something extraordinary. By forcing the Japanese fighters down to sea level and scattering their defensive formations, they cleared the skies for the next wave. At 10:22 a.m., as if guided by fate, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared high above the Japanese fleet. In mere minutes, history pivoted. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in fire, their decks packed with fueled aircraft and live ordnance. The explosions turned each vessel into a floating inferno. Sailors leapt into burning seas as their proud ships died beneath them. Only Hiryu remained, lashing back in defiance. Her pilot struck Yorktown hard, crippling the carrier, but vengeance came swiftly. Before the sun set, Hiryu too was fatally struck, her flight deck swallowed by fire. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers and 1 cruiser lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Japan had lost 3,050 men, 248 aircraft, and perhaps most devastating of all, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, mechanics, and technicians. The United States had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Tactically, the result was obvious. Japan's advance was broken. Strategically, it was the beginning of the end. The deeper consequence, the one unseen at first, was the exposure of Japan's fatal weakness, its inability to replace what had been lost. At the outbreak of war, Japan possessed 6 large carriers and 5 smaller ones. The U.S. Navy had only 3 major carriers in the Pacific. The question was not who had more ships. It was who could build faster. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, speaking to Congress less than a month after Pearl Harbor, had declared what sounded like madness. 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. Even his own advisors doubted it. Yet those targets were not only met, they were exceeded. The scale of America's mobilization was beyond imagination. It was the greatest sustained industrial effort in human history. In the 3 years after Midway, Japanese shipyards managed to build 6 aircraft carriers. In that same period, the United States produced 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers. Each Essex-class carrier was an engineering marvel, 870 feet long, displacing 30,000 tons, and capable of carrying more than 90 aircraft. At peak efficiency, American shipyards were launching 1 Essex-class carrier every 6 weeks. The figures defied belief. In 1944 alone, American factories built more aircraft than Japan produced during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. The total numbers tell the story starkly: 297,000 American aircraft versus 76,000 Japanese. By early 1943, American shipyards had launched more tonnage in 4.5 months than Japan had produced in 7 years. At Willow Run, the vast Ford Motor Company plant near Detroit, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. Tanks, trucks, artillery, each category revealed the same staggering gap. America built 86,000 tanks to Japan's 2,000, 2 million trucks to Japan's 165,000. In guns, munitions, and small arms, American output exceeded Japan's by factors of 5 to 20. Japanese intelligence was not blind. They had access to most of these statistics through neutral sources, reconnaissance, and observation on the battlefield. Yet even confronted with the truth, they refused to believe it. The data contradicted their worldview so completely that they could not reconcile it. To accept the numbers was to accept the inevitability of defeat. And so they clung to hope that American quality would falter, that Japanese spirit could overcome industry, that courage might yet reverse arithmetic. Admiral Yamamoto harbored no such illusions. As the war dragged on, his understanding of America's power deepened into grim certainty. Historians still debate whether he truly spoke the legendary line attributed to him after Pearl Harbor: "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." No record of those exact words exists. They first appeared in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. But even if fiction, the sentiment was truth. Yamamoto had, in fact, written something even more revealing in a letter dated January 9, 1942. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. He understood that striking an unprepared foe proved nothing. The true measure of power would come when that foe awoke, when America's boundless factories, its ingenuity, and its resolve were fully unleashed. And when that moment came, it would sweep across the Pacific like a tide no fleet could withstand. 1942, the tide begins to turn. Imagine the thunder of machinery echoing across America factories, glowing through the night, furnaces roaring, assembly lines alive with purpose. By 1943, this vast industrial engine was running at full power, translating raw numbers into operational dominance on every battlefield across the Pacific. It was at Guadalcanal, from August 1942 to February 1943, that this transformation first took visible form. Picture that remote island. Dense jungle, humid air thick with insects and smoke, the endless crash of surf and artillery. For months, the struggle raged in a brutal rhythm of attack and counterattack. What began as a desperate foothold became a test of endurance, and America proved it could sustain war across thousands of miles of ocean. For Japan, the campaign revealed a hidden wound. one that strategy and courage could not mend: logistics. Japan had planned for lightning victories swift and decisive, but at Guadalcanal, the war turned into a slow, grinding contest of production and supply, and Japan was not built for that. The arteries of the empire, its merchant fleet, began to bleed out under the relentless assault of American submarines. Each month, Japanese ships vanished beneath the waves faster than new ones could be built. By 1943, U.S. submarines were sinking more Japanese tonnage than Japan's shipyards could launch. By 1944, the merchant marine was collapsing entirely. Tankers meant to carry precious oil from the Dutch East Indies never made it home. The very resource Japan had gone to war for now lay trapped at sea, cut off by American torpedoes. The pattern repeated in the skies. Japan's early war triumphs had been carried on the wings of the Mitsubishi AC-6M0. Sleek, deadly, seemingly invincible in 1940. But innovation stagnated. While Japanese factories struggled to produce the same designs in dwindling numbers, American production leapt ahead in both quantity and technology. From the modest F-4F Wildcat came the faster F-6F Hellcat, and then the formidable F-4U Corsair, each iteration deadlier than the last. By 1943, the balance of the air war had reversed completely. American fighters were faster, stronger, and far more numerous. Training deepened the divide. The United States, with its vast educational infrastructure, could train pilots on an industrial scale. Cadets learned not only to fly, but to navigate, to fight in formation, to master complex instruments. Graduation rates remained high, and the flow of new airmen never stopped. Japan, drained by casualties and short on fuel, cut training time and lowered standards. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with a fraction of the flight hours of their American counterparts. The result was inevitable: one-sided battles where courage met overwhelming skill and firepower. And yet, despite mounting evidence of American supremacy, many Japanese commanders refused to yield to reality. Their faith clung to an ancient ideal, the Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan. It taught that willpower and honor could overcome any material disadvantage. The Bushido Code, exalting sacrifice and death before surrender, infused every order and every last stand. These beliefs produced moments of astonishing valor, but they also blinded Japan's leadership to the grim truth. By the summer of 1944, illusions finally shattered with the fall of the Mariana Islands. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. American troops came ashore under the thunder of massive naval gunfire. Backed by endless supplies of men and material, the defenders fought with suicidal resolve. Civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender, yet the outcome was never in doubt. Saipan fell on July 9th. Tinian followed on August 1st. Guam was secured by August 10th. The consequences were enormous. The Marianas placed the American B-29 Superfortress bombers within direct range of the Japanese home islands. Japan's once impregnable defensive ring had been pierced. The war was now coming to Japan itself. Within Tokyo, panic and recrimination followed. The stunning loss shattered confidence in the government. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, architect of Japan's expansion and war policy, became the scapegoat. On July 18, 1944, stripped of support, he resigned. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited a nation trapped in the illusion of resistance. The war was militarily lost, yet surrender remained unthinkable. The government still dreamed of a miracle, one that would never arrive. Even as Japan reeled from the Mariana defeats, the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted on June 19, 1944. It was a slaughter. Japanese naval aviation, already gutted by years of attrition, launched one last grand offensive and met annihilation. American pilots, flying superior aircraft in overwhelming numbers, destroyed nearly 480 Japanese planes and 3 carriers, including the pride of the fleet, Taiho. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japan, it was the death of its naval air arm. From that point on, American commanders, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, fought with the calm assurance of men who knew they could not lose. Their fleets sailed forward with confidence born not of arrogance, but of arithmetic. Every invasion plan assumed abundance, ample fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements. The Japanese, by contrast, fought on with empty warehouses and hollow hopes. Their soldiers defended islands knowing that no resupply, no reinforcement, no rescue would come. And yet the American advance continued. On October 20th, 1944, U.S. forces landed on Leyte, launching the liberation of the Philippines, supported by the largest naval armada the Pacific had ever seen. The tide of war had not merely turned, it had become a flood, a relentless surge of industrial power sweeping inexorably toward Japan's shores. October 23rd, 26th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Picture it, the Philippines, the restless sea alive with smoke and steel. Japan's naval command, cornered and desperate, commits nearly every remaining warship in a final, defiant gamble, a last bid to turn back the American tide. The result will become the largest naval battle in human history, 4 sprawling engagements across hundreds of miles of ocean, and the death knell of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It began in the Sibuyan Sea, where American carrier planes swarmed over the giant battleship Musashi, a leviathan of the waves bristling with guns. Wave after wave of carrier-based bombers descended, turning the sea into boiling chaos. Hours later, the pride of Japan's fleet slipped beneath the water, a mountain of steel consumed by the deep. Next came the Surigao Strait, a scene straight from another era, battleship against battleship. But this time, the Americans held every advantage. In a storm of shells and torpedoes, U.S. destroyers and battleships annihilated the Japanese southern force, crossing their enemy's T in one of naval history's last classic gun duels. To the north, off Samar, chaos reigned. The Japanese Central Force stumbled upon a small American escort group, jeep carriers and destroyer escorts, an encounter that could have ended in disaster for the U.S. Yet confusion, hesitation, and command failure turned potential victory into wasted opportunity. The Americans fought with desperate valor, tiny destroyers charging giant cruisers and battleships, a clash so improbable it became legend. Finally, off Cape Engano, the remnants of Japan's carrier aviation met their end. American planes swept down like hawks, sending the last Japanese carriers to the bottom. By October 26th, the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. In just 4 days, Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and thousands of trained sailors. Never again would Japan sortie a fleet in strength. The ocean, once her path to empire, had become her grave. But even as Japan's fleets sank beneath the waves, destruction from the sky was closing in on the homeland. 1944 and 1945, the fire from above. From their newly captured bases in the Marianas, B-29 Superfortress bombers began a relentless campaign that carried the war directly to Japan's cities. At first, the bombing was precise, targeting factories and arsenals. But as resistance continued, strategy shifted. The goal became simple: to burn Japan's industrial heart to ashes. On the night of March 9, 1945, the sky over Tokyo turned into a furnace, Operation Meeting House. The firebombing of Japan's capital remains the single most destructive air raid in human history. 334 B-29 bombers unleashed 1,665 tons of incendiaries on the city's densely packed neighborhoods. In just a few hours, Tokyo became an inferno. The flames spread faster than men could run. Asphalt bubbled, rivers boiled, entire districts vanished in firestorms that devoured oxygen and human life alike. By dawn, 100,000 people were dead, 1 million left homeless, and 16 square miles of the city had been erased. The destruction exceeded even that of the atomic bombings to come. Across Japan, 66 cities suffered similar attacks. By war's end, between 350,000 and 500,000 civilians had perished in the bombing campaign. Factories, homes, temples all turned to ash. Yet, even as cities vanished and millions suffered, Japan's military government refused to yield. The generals, bound by Bushido and haunted by the idea of surrender as dishonor, vowed to fight to the last breath. Amid this ruin, one man's conscience began to stir: Emperor Hirohito. Traditionally distant from politics, he now received regular military briefings. By early 1945, he knew the truth. Japan faced inevitable defeat, but under the nation's constitution, he lacked direct authority to end the war. The army's grip on the government made surrender politically impossible. Japan was trapped between pride and annihilation. August 1945, the end approaches. Japan's final hope lay not on the battlefield, but in diplomacy, a fragile dream of Soviet mediation. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 had kept the Northern Front quiet. Some in Tokyo believed Joseph Stalin might broker peace with the Western Allies, sparing Japan the humiliation of unconditional surrender. But this was a fantasy. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had secretly pledged to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8th, and precisely 90 days later, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Within hours, the Red Army surged into Manchuria, an unstoppable avalanche of tanks, artillery, and men. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most feared force, collapsed in a week. Soviet troops crushed fortifications that had taken years to build, overrunning vast territories in days. Japan's last diplomatic lifeline had snapped. The empire was encircled and doomed. Yet even this catastrophe did not bring immediate surrender. The army leadership clung to a final delusion that by inflicting horrific casualties during the anticipated American invasion, they could still negotiate better terms. Then came the final horror, the atomic bombings. On August 6th, Hiroshima vanished in a single blinding flash. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. In both cities, some 130,000 people died instantly, with tens of thousands more succumbing to burns and radiation in the days that followed. Still, Japan's military faction argued that surrender was unthinkable. It took an act of will that transcended centuries of imperial distance. Emperor Hirohito, breaking with precedent, intervened personally. His decision would end the war. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice, heard by his people for the first time, crackled across the radio waves. He avoided the word surrender, instead speaking obliquely, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." Those words shattered years of propaganda. In an instant, the illusion of victory evaporated. Japan had fallen silent under the weight of defeat. Aftermath, the reckoning. In the ashes of empire, General Douglas MacArthur, now Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, arrived to oversee Japan's occupation and rebirth. To the Japanese people, the sight of American abundance, trucks, food, radios, endless supplies, was both humbling and transformative. For Japan's military elite, the reckoning was harsher still. Interrogations and war crimes trials forced them to confront the scale of their failure. Hideki Tojo, once prime minister and architect of war, faced his accusers and confessed what he had long denied. We did not adequately understand the American potential. It was an extraordinary admission. The echo of Yamamoto's warning come full circle. Japan's defeat had never been merely a matter of weapons or ships, but of imagination, a tragic inability to grasp the vastness of the enemy's power. The war had begun with ambition and illusion. It ended in fire, humility, and the rebirth of a nation that would, in time, learn to wield its ingenuity not for conquest, but for creation. Imagine standing amid the ruins of Tokyo in 1945, the air still heavy with smoke, the silence broken only by the sound of rebuilding that had just begun. Now ask yourself, how did it come to this? How could a nation that struck with such audacity at Pearl Harbor be brought so completely to ruin within 4 short years? The answer, as history would reveal, was not found in courage or luck, but in a profound failure of understanding. Japanese military planners had never truly comprehended the scale of American logistics. The ability to move men, machines, and supplies across oceans as though distance itself were irrelevant. They had underestimated America's technological innovation and, most fatally, misunderstood the very soul of American military doctrine. The United States waged war not through mysticism or spirit, but through the cold arithmetic of material superiority. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who had commanded the carriers at Pearl Harbor and Midway, would not live to see this realization take shape. During the desperate Battle of Saipan in July 1944, he took his own life rather than face defeat. Yet, his surviving officers, when later questioned, revealed the truth. Japanese intelligence had been accurate all along. They had known the figures: America's vast industrial potential, its shipbuilding, its aircraft output. The failure lay not in gathering information, but in accepting what it meant. Post-war historians, Japanese and American alike, would call this the core of Japan's strategic blindness. Japan had gambled on a quick, decisive war because its leaders knew they could never survive a prolonged one. But that gamble rested on a false belief that the Americans lacked the will to fight. Japanese planners viewed their enemy as soft, decadent, divided, a people too enamored with comfort to bear the suffering of total war. They imagined that the shock of Pearl Harbor would break American resolve, forcing the United States to accept Japanese dominance in Asia. Instead, Pearl Harbor forged unity from division. The outrage of December 7, 1941, transformed a hesitant democracy into a nation utterly committed to war. The industrial potential that Japanese planners had dismissed as sleeping suddenly awoke, immense, relentless, unstoppable. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's production goals, which had seemed almost delusional in 1941, were not only achieved, they were surpassed. Factories that once built cars now forged tanks, bombers, and ships. Women filled the assembly lines, their hands riveting the machines that would carry victory across the Pacific. Farms, driven by mechanization, produced more food than ever before. Mines and mills expanded output to meet both domestic and military needs. By 1943, the United States economy was growing by 15% annually, even while it armed itself, fed its people, and supplied its allies across the world. The contrast with Japan could not have been more brutal. Japan's smaller economy was already strained before the war began. Once American submarines began their campaign of attrition, Japan's merchant fleet, the arteries of its empire, withered away. The flow of oil, rubber, and steel from conquered territories slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Strategic bombing leveled Japan's cities and factories. By 1945, the nation's industrial machinery was barely functioning. Consider the numbers. By that final year, Japan's aircraft production had collapsed to about 150 planes per month. The United States was producing over 8,000 every month. Japanese soldiers fought with empty magazines, while American troops had ammunition to spare. Japanese civilians starved. American servicemen dined on full rations and cigarettes. Years later, the men who had once commanded Japan's fleets and armies would speak with startling honesty about the war they had lost. Admiral Somu Toyoda, last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs words that cut to the bone. "We understood American material superiority intellectually, but we did not grasp its implications emotionally. We believed spirit could overcome matter. This was our fundamental error." Mitsumasa Yonai, who had served both as Prime Minister and Navy Minister, told interrogators in 1945 that many naval officers had warned civilian leaders. War with America was unwinnable. But those warnings were drowned out by the Army's ideological fervor. Pride silenced reason. Even among the fighter pilots, those knights of the sky, disillusionment grew. Saburo Sakai, Japan's famed ace with 64 confirmed victories, described in his 1957 autobiography, Samurai, the Grim Decline of Japan's Air Arm. By 1944, we veteran pilots knew we were losing. We could see the quality of American aircraft improving while ours stagnated. We could see their numbers increasing while ours declined. But we kept fighting because we had no choice. He remembered watching newly trained aviators, boys with barely any flight time, sent to certain death. They never had a chance. He wrote simply, after the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey compiled the hard data, the cold mathematics of victory and defeat. The findings were staggering. America had produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment in the entire conflict. Its factories built more than 5,000 ships, not only replacing all that the Axis had sunk, but expanding Allied capacity beyond pre-war levels. Japan, by comparison, had built 6 carriers after Midway. America had built 122. Japan produced 76,000 aircraft in total. America, nearly 300,000. Japan built 165,000 trucks. America, 2 million. It was not merely a difference in scale, it was a difference in worldview. Japan had fought with faith and spirit. America fought with faith in systems, science, and supply. And in the end, spirit met steel, and steel endured. Picture the end. The cities in ruins. The skies once filled with Zero fighters now quiet, and a nation standing amid ashes that stretched from Tokyo to Nagasaki. What had begun with a thunderous strike at Pearl Harbor ended in silence, a silence filled with questions that Japan's surviving leaders could no longer ignore. By 1945, the magnitude of Japan's miscalculation stood revealed not in statistics alone, but in the immeasurable cost of human life. More than 2,800,000 Japanese soldiers had perished. Between 500,000 and 1 million civilians had died from bombing, starvation, and the cruel arithmetic of a war their leaders had known was unwinnable from the start. These were not the casualties of ignorance. They were the price of strategic self-deception. For Japan's high command, the moment of realization did not come all at once. For some, like Admiral Yamamoto, the truth had been clear from the beginning. He had seen the giant before it awoke. For others, the awakening came later, in the blackened waters off Midway, in the firestorms over Tokyo, in the collapse of Saipan, or the blinding flash of Hiroshima. But in the end, every surviving commander was forced to confront the same immutable truth. The war had been lost before it had even begun. In the decades that followed, Japan rose from ruin to prosperity with breathtaking speed. By the 1980s, it had become the second largest economy in the world, not through conquest or empire, but through industry, trade, and innovation. The very power its pre-war leaders had sought to seize by force was ultimately achieved through peaceful enterprise. The factories that once built engines of war now produced engines of progress, cars, ships, and technology that would reshape the modern world. This transformation carried a profound moral and strategic lesson. The tragedy of 1941 to 1945 became more than a national wound. It became a warning to future generations about the peril of believing in myths rather than realities. Japan's leaders had possessed the information, the statistics, the intelligence reports, the warnings of cautious admirals and economists. The data had all been there, clear and cold. Yet they chose not to believe. Culture, ideology, and institutional pride blinded them to what those numbers truly meant. The cost of that blindness was measured not in lost battles, but in millions of lives. For some officers, the realization came in the sky, in the endless swarms of American bombers that blotted out the sun. Others saw it on the seas as convoys of American ships stretched to the horizon, each one laden with supplies that never seemed to run out. Some understood it when their own soldiers went hungry, while American prisoners of war were fed with regular rations. Others finally comprehended it only when B-29s turned their cities to molten ruin. By then, the truth was inescapable. America's industrial capacity was not propaganda. It was a material fact as undeniable as gravity. It had determined the war's outcome long before the final battles were fought. The equations of defeat, steel, oil, machines, and men, had been written in the ledgers of production before a single bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese High Command had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, but they had never imagined the scale of its strength. The United States possessed a productive power so vast that Japan's courage, ingenuity, and discipline, however remarkable, could not hope to match it. And so the final truth was this: the war's end had been predetermined by numbers, not by luck or heroism. The leadership of Imperial Japan had gambled against arithmetic and lost. By August 1945, that misjudgment had been paid for in full. The ruins of empire bore witness to history's most costly lesson. That industrial power, more than spirit or strategy, decides the fate of nations at war.